videos, I read books, I do tinkly videos, role plays, all ASMR vlogs, all those sorts of things. But in today's video, I will be reading 3 stories from this Treasury of Stories, originally created by Beatrix Potter. This is an ASMR video after all. I wanted to give you some tingles. You can use this to help you fall asleep. And if you have children, you can let them listen to this story collection that I'm reading. But in the meantime, let's get started. The first story I'm going to read is The Tale of Peter Rabbit. Once there were 4 little bunnies named Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother under a big fir tree. One sunny morning, Mother Rabbit told her little bunnies, "You may go and play, but be sure to stay out of Mr. McGregor's garden. He does not like little rabbits, and he will come chasing after you." So, Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail each took a basket, hoping to find some sweet wild blackberries. And Peter thought he looked rather fine in his new blue jacket with the shiny brass buttons. "Run along now," said Mother Rabbit. "I am going to the baker's." And off she went to buy a loaf of brown bread and 5 cinnamon buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail were good little bunnies. They always listened to their mother. They went down the lane to look for blackberries. But Peter was a naughty rabbit. He ran down the lane, through the fields, and squeezed under the gate to Mr. McGregor's garden. He could hardly wait to nibble on some crunchy radishes and carrots. First, Peter ate some lettuce and green beans. Then he ate some radishes. The carrots were delicious, but the onions were too strong for his taste. When Peter's tummy began to ache, he went to look for some parsley. But at the end of a garden row, Peter saw Mr. McGregor. The farmer was on his hands and knees, planting young cabbages. When Mr. McGregor saw Peter Rabbit, he jumped up, grabbed his rake, and chased after the scared little bunny. "Stop, thief!" shouted Mr. McGregor. Peter was very frightened. He ran through the garden looking for the gate. Where was it? Peter knew he was lost. Poor Peter lost one shoe among the cabbages and the other in the potato patch. Without his shoes, he could run much faster. He might have gotten away, but the shiny brass buttons on his new blue jacket tangled in a gooseberry net. The only way Peter could get free was to wiggle out of his new blue jacket and leave it behind. Peter shed big tears. He was sure he would never find his way home. Peter had no time to feel sorry for himself. Mr. McGregor was not far behind. Hop, jump. Peter rushed into a tool shed and jumped inside a watering can. It would have been a good place to hide had it not been half full of water. Mr. McGregor was sure Peter was hiding in the shed. Quietly and carefully, he began turning over flower pots, looking under each one for the naughty little rabbit. "Ka-chew!" Peter sneezed, and Mr. McGregor was after him again. Peter leapt out the window, upsetting 3 flower pots. Mr. McGregor tried to follow him, but the window was too small, and Mr. McGregor was tired of chasing the little rabbit, so he went back to work in the garden. Peter sat down to rest. He was shaking with fear and was out of breath. He did not know which way to go. He was also very damp from sitting inside that watering can. After a while, he began to wander around, going hippity-hop, not very fast. He saw a door in the wall, but it was locked. Just then, a little mouse scampered past him. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had a large pea in her mouth and could not answer. She only shook her head at him. Peter began to cry again. Peter wandered across the garden to a fish pond. There, a white cat sat very still, staring at the goldfish swimming in the pond. Peter had been warned about cats. He decided not to ask her the way to the gate. Peter became more and more confused. He went back toward the tool shed. Suddenly, close to him, he heard the noise of a hoe. Scritch, scratch, scratch, scritch. saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. He had his back to Peter. There it was, just across the garden, beyond Mr. McGregor, was the gate. Peter ran to the gate as fast as he could and slid underneath it to safety. Mr. McGregor could not catch him now. Peter did not stop running until he reached his home beneath the big fir tree. Mother Rabbit was busy cooking. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail were having a supper of bread, milk, and blackberries. Peter was too tired to eat. He flopped down on the soft sand floor and went to sleep. Peter's mother tucked him into bed and gave him a dose of chamomile tea. 1 tablespoon to be taken at bedtime. Mother Rabbit watched Peter sleep. She wondered where he had lost his little shoes and his new blue jacket with the shiny brass buttons. Only Mr. McGregor knew where Peter's clothes were. He had hung them up like a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds away from his garden. The second tale is the tale of Mrs. Tiggy Winkle. Once upon a time, there was a little girl named Lucy who lived on a farm. She was a good little girl, but she was always losing her pocket handkerchiefs. One day, little Lucy came into the farmyard crying, "I've lost my handkerchief. 3 handkerchiefs in a pinafore. Have you seen them, Tabby Kitten?" The kitten went on washing her white paws. Lucy asked a speckled hen, "Sally Hennypenny, have you found 3 handkerchiefs?" But the speckled hen ran into the barn clucking, "I go barefoot, barefoot, barefoot." Lucy climbed the steps in the garden wall and looked up the hillside. She thought she saw some white things spread upon the grass. Lucy scrambled up the hill as fast as her legs could carry her. She ran along a steep pathway, up and up. Soon she came to a spring bubbling up from the hillside, and where the sand upon the path was wet, there were footprints of a very small person. The path ended under a big rock. There were clotheslines of braided grass hanging from stems and sticks. A heap of tiny clothespins was on the ground, but there were no handkerchiefs. There was something else, though. A door. It led straight into the hill, and beyond it was someone singing. Lily white and clean, oh, with little frills between, oh, smooth and hot, red nice, clean kitchen. It was just like any other farm kitchen, except that the ceiling was so low that Lucy's head nearly touched it. The pots and pans were small, and so was everything else. There, at the table with an iron in her hand, stood a very short, plump person staring anxiously at Lucy. Her print gown was tucked up, and she was wearing a large apron over her striped petticoat. Her little black nose went sniffle, snuffle, and her eyes went twinkle, twinkle. And underneath her cap, where Lucy had yellow curls, the little person had prickles. "Who are you?" asked Lucy. "Have you seen my pocket handkerchiefs?" The little person curtsied. "Oh, yes, miss. My name is Mrs. Tiggy Winkle." And she took something out of a clothes basket and spread it on the ironing blanket. "That's not my handkerchief," said Lucy. "Oh, no, if you please, miss. That's a little red vest belonging to Cock Robin." And she ironed it and folded it. Mrs. Tiggy Winkle took another hot iron from the fire. "There's one of my handkerchiefs," cried Lucy, "and there's my pinafore." Mrs. Tiggy Winkle ironed the pinafore and shook out the ruffles. "Oh, that is lovely," said Lucy. "Are those yellow gloves?" asked Lucy. "No, oh no, that's a pair of stockings belonging to Sally Hennypenny. Look how she's worn out the heels from scratching in the barnyard. She'll very soon go barefoot. And whose red handkerchief is this?" "If you please, miss, it belongs to old Mrs. Rabbit. It did smell so of onions, I had to wash it separately," said Mrs. Tiggy Winkle. "What are these funny white things?" asked Lucy. "That's a pair of mittens belonging to Tabby Kitten. I only have to iron them. She washes them herself." "Here are my handkerchiefs," said Lucy. At last, the basket was empty. After they sorted the wash, Mrs. Tiggy Winkle made tea, a cup for herself and a cup for Lucy. She and Lucy sat on a bench in front of the fire and looked at one another. Mrs. Tiggy Winkle's hands were very, very brown and very, very wrinkly from the soap suds, and all through her gown and cap there were hairpins sticking wrong end out. When they had finished tea, they tied up the clothes in bundles. Lucy's handkerchiefs were folded up inside her clean pinafore and fastened with a silver safety pin. Then away down the hill trotted Lucy and Mrs. Tiggy Winkle with the bundles of clothes. All the way down the path Mrs. Tiggy Winkle and Lucy gave them all their nice clean clothes. The little animals and birds were very grateful to dear Mrs. Tiggy Winkle. At the bottom of the hill, they came to the garden steps. There was nothing left to carry except Lucy's one little bundle. Lucy scrambled up the steps with the bundle in her arms. She turned to say good night and to thank the washerwoman. But how very odd. Mrs. Tiggy Winkle had not waited for thanks. She was running up the hill, and where was her white ruffled cap, and her shawl, and her gown, and her petticoat? And how small she seemed, and how brown, and covered with prickles. Why, Mrs. Tiggy Winkle was nothing but a hedgehog. Now, some people say that little Lucy had been sleeping and dreaming on the garden steps. But then, how could she have found 3 clean handkerchiefs and a pinafore, all pinned with a silver safety pin? And besides, I have seen that door on the hill called Cat Bells. And besides, I am a good friend of dear Mrs. Tiggy Winkle. Finally, we have the tale of Tom Kitten. Once there were 3 little kittens, and their names were Moppet, Mittens, and Tom Kitten. The kittens had beautiful little fur coats, but they liked to tumble about in the yard and play in the dust. They never stayed clean long. One day, their mother, Mrs. Tabitha Twitchit, expected several of her fine friends for tea. She called her kittens indoors to wash and dress before her company arrived. First, she scrubbed their faces. Next, she brushed their fur and combed their tails and whiskers. When the kittens were clean, Mrs. Tabitha dressed Moppet and Mittens in fine dresses. But her son Thomas, she took all sorts of handsome but uncomfortable clothes out of the dresser drawers. Tom Kitten had grown fat. 3 buttons popped off of his jacket. His mother sewed them on again. When the 3 kittens were ready, Mrs. Tabitha let them out to play while she made hot buttered toast for her tea party. Now, keep your clothes clean, children, she called. Keep away from the dirt, Sally Hennypenny, the pig pen, and most of all, keep away from the puddle ducks. Moppet and Mittens found it difficult to walk. They tripped on the hems of their dresses and fell on their noses. When they stood up, there were several green stains. "Let's climb up the rocks and sit on the garden wall," said Moppet. They turned their dresses back to front and scampered up onto the wall. Tom Kitten could not jump while wearing trousers. He slowly climbed the rocks, holding on to ferns. He popped buttons left and right. He was in pieces by the time he reached the top of the garden wall. Moppet and Mittens tried to pull him together, but his hat fell off, and the rest of his buttons burst. Tom wriggled out of his coat and trousers. They landed in a heap on the ground. In the middle of all his trouble, the kittens heard a pit-pat, paddle-pat. The 3 puddle ducks were coming down the road. They were marching one behind the other, doing the goose step. Pit-pat, paddle-pat, pit-pat, waddle-pat. The puddle ducks stopped and stood in a row and stared up at the kittens. They had very small eyes, and they looked surprised. Then Rebecca and Jemima Puddle Duck picked up Tom's hat and Moppet's lace handkerchief and put them on. Mr. Drake Puddle Duck thought this looked like a good idea. He picked up Tom's suit and put it on himself. "It's a fine morning," he quacked. The suit fit Mr. Drake even worse than it fit Tom Kitten. Moppet, Mittens, and Tom Kitten laughed so hard they nearly fell off the wall. Mr. Drake, Rebecca, and Jemima Puddle Duck waddled up the road with a pit-pat, paddle-pat, pit-pat, waddle-pat. They were a sight. Mrs. Tabitha Twitchit came down the garden walk and found her kittens wearing none of their fine clothes. She scolded them and dragged them back to the house. "My friends will arrive in a minute, and you are not fit to be seen. I am embarrassed," said Mrs. Tabitha Twitchit. Moppet, Mittens, and Tom were sent up to their room. When her friends arrived, Mrs. Tabitha told them that her little kittens were in bed sick with the measles, which, of course, was not true at all. Oh no! Those 3 little kittens were not in bed. Not in the least. Mrs. Tabitha Twitchit's guests heard some very strange noises coming from upstairs. The ladies found their quiet tea party to be spoiled. I think that someday I shall write another, longer book to tell you more